So welcome everybody. Thank you for making the trek all the way to the far end of the building. Last time I gave a presentation, I was like one room up, you know. I don't know. Anyways, no big deal. Appreciate everybody for coming. I am going to, we've got a small group, which is kind of good because I'm hoping to talk and hear a little bit from you folks. I'll quickly introduce myself. I've been around the Twin Cities for a long time. I spent about 10 years working in online civic engagement and e-democracy, part of some deliberative democracy groups. I've been involved in, so when we talk about open source as a political act, I've been engaged civically, not necessarily partisanly, for a long time. About 2010, my life took a turn. I put this up here just to show that I'm not always rational and sane. I took a little detour and bought a Chinese restaurant from a friend of mine. That didn't go very well. It lasted about a year. And since then, I kind of, I never really did a great job at making a living with the e-democracy stuff. It was always a struggle. And for the last 6 years, I've been looking to sort of transition and find a more profitable career. And I've been working in the Drupal community. I currently run a small Drupal shop called Triplo. Because we're a small enough group, I'd like to quickly hear who's in the audience. I mean, I'm going to say a little bit more about myself. I'm not coming here really as an expert in free software or open source software. I am somebody who's been involved in a community. I'm thinking a lot about it, and part of the purpose of this presentation was to give me the chance to think about and talk about some issues that just were of interest to me. And I'd like to hear a little bit like who's in the room. There might be people here who know a lot more about this. So if we could go around just quickly, like your name and your relationship with free and open source software. Are you just a user? Are you a contributor? Do you belong to communities? Are you an advocate? You know, have you ever donated to the Free Software Foundation? That might tell me something about your level of commitment. Anybody want to start? Can we start with, you're chewing.
No, I'm done now. I was waiting. I was like, oh, if he calls on me, I'm going to have food in my mouth. I'm Chris McGowan. Nice to meet everybody. My relation, so I'm a software developer, and I'm actually working on an app on my phone, and I've developed some other software outside of my for other companies and stuff. None of it's been open source, and I think about that, and I support open source. So I run Open Office. I don't have Word on my machine, and I pay for Open Office, and I give money to the software that I use, and I try to use open source software. And I think it's really important.
Go ahead.
One of the topics that I think would be interesting to talk about is, you know, I work at Thomson Reuters, and we use tons of open source software. We're running everything, all that stuff, Jenkins, Java, all the tools, Cucumber, it's all open source. And I wonder, I'm a contractor, so I don't really talk about it, but I would love to go to the people who manage those groups and say, are you giving money back to those organizations? Because I think that's, you know, and from a political standpoint, has anyone ever heard of the Halloween documents? Microsoft?
I haven't.
Have you heard of it?
No.
Okay, you should Google this. It's really interesting. So there's documents of Halloween 1, Halloween 2, Halloween 3, and Halloween 4. These documents were published by Microsoft on Halloween, and they're a long time ago. It's like in the 1990s about what Microsoft can do to squash the open source movement, particularly Linux and some of those movements. So it's really, you should, if you Google Halloween documents or something like that, you should find it.
Good.
My name's Jeremy. I've been working with open source for a long time, mostly PHP CMSs. I started a user forum here in Minneapolis based around bicycling using PHP BB. It was just free and easy, and we ended up getting to about 6,000 users by the time that it was done, and being able to, like, I could send out an email to the users and actually have a city hall city council person find my phone number and call me up and ask me why their phone was ringing off the hook, and stopped one of the bicycle boulevards they were putting in. Like, according to the political process, it couldn't be changed yet. And I sent off an email at 10 o'clock at night saying, hey, we're gonna we can pretty much shut down any street that we want to, organized in completely legal fashion, just by coordinating with the software. And you should really think about that and maybe not do this project. And as you found, it didn't really pay.
Right.
So at that same point, I was, I couldn't pay my rent, and ended up actually going in on a 3-day psych hold just because it was
Okay.
just so hard to hold that dichotomy of what I could do on the internet, online, for free, and then just having it be so important but not be able to do more with it. I've been working with a CMS called Concrete 5, which
Sure.
is also open source. They went open source in 2008, and I contribute back to that project. I've put some code directly into the GitHub repo and stuff on the older versions, and I've released a whole lot of like tutorials for people. So when I figured out how to do stuff, I'd release a package with sample code and big long blog posts and everything. So,
Okay. So you've been actively using and contributing to open source.
yeah.
Okay. How about you?
Hi, my name is Ryan Mulcahy. I am a heavy user of open source software, so I'm a software developer by trade. I use every part of my job relies on open source software to be successful. I have contributed very slightly to a few GitHub projects, mostly with trying to file issues and test things and sometimes submit code. I love open source software and would like to get to a point where I am a better steward, contributor kind of person in the community, and I'm using it more. I have previously donated to the Free Software Foundation, but I'm not currently like a supporting member, but
Sure.
I thank you for reminding me.
Good. How about you, sir?
My name is Riley Major. I don't do a lot with open source,
Okay.
so
Okay. Use it?
incidentally,
Right.
occasionally, open office, I guess.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of us use it in a lot of ways that we don't know through things, big projects like Apache and things like that. But
Hi, my name's Lori Most. Started a company with some software. I'm debating if I should go open source or not. So I'm just here to kind of hear about it a little bit more, pros, cons.
okay. Good.
Hey, I'm Ian. I've been using open source for a long time, starting as kind of like a personal interest thing. Started running Linux as my main operating system in college and so on. And now professionally as a web developer, I work with tons and tons of open source. Just as in the everyday stuff, because that's kind of where the world is now. They likewise have donated to the Free Software Foundation at one point, but not every year like I should be doing.
Okay.
I'm Richard Marsh. I'm a computer science and math student currently. I'm the information security intern on the side. With open source, I've been using GNU plus Linux,
Okay.
if I'm
Sure.
in the right audience, for a number of years. Professionally, I'm stuck in the Windows world. I have not contributed because I'm a student, and all the code I write is pretty much enough to get graded. But eventually, once I'm done and my code's good enough, I'd like to contribute mostly to the kernel.
Good.
My name is Jeremy Price. I've used open source software at work before, and I know that I will continue to do so more in depth as I get increased responsibilities and such. I'd love to start, contributing, but as just starting out as a developer, I've had a lot of experience doing that yet, but I'm sure one day I will start to contribute to that. I haven't donated.
Okay. Good. How about you?
My name is Beth. I'm a nonprofit fundraiser. So I work with a lot of different nonprofits. So of course I like your little last bullet there. I am mostly a user of open source software. A lot of the websites that nonprofits use are open.
Okay.
I'm Kelsey. I'm a designer, and I've been a user of open source programs, but I'm mostly interested in how non-developer type people can get involved in the community. So I really like the kind of
Great.
I'm Tennille Rocco. I'm a senior at Roseman High School. I've explored open source software and tinkered with the code, and I think I've learned a lot from it, like reading other people's code. And also, I've contributed a couple of libraries to CDN.
Great.
My name's Linda. I'm currently an IT lead for a small college at the university, but I feel at a career crossroads. Do I want to stay with management? Do I want to go back to development? I've done a lot of web development in the past, really enjoyed it, and so I've been a heavy consumer of open source and really appreciated it, but never really given back. And I'm feeling particularly drawn to Drupal and thinking about how to get involved in contributing to the Drupal code base. So I'm just kind of
Okay.
dipping a toe in.
Well, good.
Place to start.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm a web developer at the University of Minnesota. I have been using open source software since I hunted down a book in like '95. So like the old days. And I've always been an advocate. I haven't contributed code back, but as I've been hearing everyone said, you can always go look in projects and look for documentation. So even if you don't feel your code is good enough, grab the easy documentation things and improve the documentation. There's always little issues that you can do that are teeny tiny, and that's a big thing about being an advocate. And I was part of the Linux Journal magazine. I've done different things, so all about advocating for open source. So.
Good.
My name is Zoe. I'm trying to learn Go.
Okay.
And wow, got a lot of typos, man. So, contributed to that documentation for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I do most of my learning through contributing to open source projects, like even if it's just like with my friends. Huge fan. I went to school for journalism and worked as a journalist for a hot second, and the open source community is really what drew me to development. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Michael Barefoot. I am a Linux engineer at the University of Minnesota. I've started out as a PHP developer and Perl developer when I got out of college a long time ago, and have been a Linux admin for over 11 years. So I spent all my professional life in open source.
Okay. And you?
My name is Ben Leadholm. I'm a Ruby developer, and a lot of the tools that I use are open source. If I can't contribute code, I +1 on the documentation.
Yeah.
And I really believe in decentralization, and that through just the competition of ideas, you get you get better stuff, and that's why I switched to Java and Ruby from the Microsoft system.
Okay. Ryan?
Hi.
We were just going around the room quick and saying your name and what your relationship with this with open source is. Are you a user, a contributor, an advocate?
Great.
Real quick.
I've met you before.
Yes, we've met. Bill
Ryan,
Bushy's birthday.
That was it?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm sure you all were there.
Little insight.
Open source. Well, I work for a company that does some open sourcing for our like third-party integration stuff. That's Granicus / Clip Delivery. Don't really contribute too much. I'm an advocate for open source and open politics, that kind of thing. And no, I have not donated.
That's okay. Truth is, I haven't yet either, but it's on my to-do list. So this was helpful for me. There's a good mix of people in here. It sounds like people who are just interested in exploring and kind of new to this. It sounds like some people who've probably been following and close to the open source movement for a long time. I'm going to share a little bit more about my own sort of connection, which is sort of in between there. The first thing is sort of why this presentation this year. Like for a lot of you, the last election may have caused some reflection and thinking about the world, where it's going, and what our role is in it, right? And while I've never been completely politically disengaged, the truth is, for the last 5 or 6 years, I've probably been less engaged than I have been in the past. And after the election, I start thinking about what am I doing? What could I be doing more of? And while I'm involved in open source and I'm involved in the Drupal community, and because I'm involved in it, I started thinking more about, things that maybe I'd been taking for granted around that. A friend of mine, Matthew Tift, who's also heavily involved in the Drupal community, was also thinking about these same things at the same time. And he runs if you're interested in this topic, he has a sporadic podcast. And by sporadic, he did like 6 of them, monthly podcasts, and then went a year and a half, and then he did another one. And he's trying to do more. So he's specifically with the same kind of focus with what we're talking about today. But he's really looking at open source in a very broad, and I'm using the terms open source and free software here interchangeably today, and I'm actually going to talk just a little bit about that, because I'd like to give a little bit of background to some of the bigger political issues around open source for those that aren't familiar with it. We'll just do it quickly. But we'll get there. Anyways, Matthew wrote this blog post called Drupal is a Political Act. And in fact, I went ahead and proposed a session at the Mid-Camp, which is a Drupal camp in Chicago next weekend, with that exact same title. And they accepted it. And then Minibar came up, and I thought, let's adapt this and try and have a similar discussion here. So I wanted to start with one of the things, and this a little bit is one of the things that concerns me a little bit. We talk about why contribute to open source, and these are some of the kinds of things you hear a lot about. And people in the room mentioned some of these things that they've contributed to open source. You can build your skills, learn, improve your resume, things like that. And you hear a lot about things like that. But this one often kind of gets ignored, I think. I mean, I think it's sort of there, but it's in the background. But to me, there should be more. There's more value to open source and free software than simply the practical economic skills we get. Matthew, in his article, wrote, Drupal code has only limited value without the community, and our community stands for values that transcend our code. I participate in the Drupal community because I believe it represents ideals that are consistent with my own. One of the beliefs that we hold in high regard is doing good. To me, so I'm taking a fairly broad definition of what a political act is for this presentation and discussion. And this is from answers.com. Any act which is intended to have an effect on the established social order. I kind of grabbed that because I'm not so interested in talking today about a political act necessarily about partisan politics or government, but just in terms of sort of the conscious use of open source as a goal to change the established social order, to make things better, to do good in the world, is my interest. And certainly one way to do that is through partisan politics or through government issues, but they're not the only ways. The session, again, is not me as an expert coming here to teach stuff, but to ask some questions, share a little bit with you what I've been thinking about, and even get some input from you folks, hopefully. It's about the idea that arguments, right. I want to talk about the fact that the value in open source beyond just the economic and the sort of educational things that get talked about a lot. I've alluded to this already in the Drupal community. I feel like there's this implied assumption, right, that we're all there to do good, but we don't talk a lot about it. And that concerns me a little bit. And because the open source community is developing and it's changing, and it concerns me that if we're not talking about this and thinking about this, will it be, are we reacting to it? Are we keeping these values in mind? Certainly within the Drupal community, there's a big shift towards big corporate involvement. And, 10 years ago, Drupal was, I'm kind of making this up, but my assumption would be that 90% of the contributions were from hobbyists, small nonprofits, things like that. Today, they recently did a study, and over 60% of the contributions, at least, that have been documented are from people working for big Drupal companies. And it's very much changing the nature of the community. And I'm not here to talk about that as a good or a bad thing. I'm talking about it, it's happening. And my concern is that we don't talk a lot about that, and we don't talk about how that's changing sort of the values in the community itself. One of the things that I don't think it's talked, you brought up these Halloween documents. Those may be very well known in sort of free software circles. I haven't, been deep into that. So I've been doing a lot of research lately and really learning my history of the open source movement recently. And it kind of concerns me a little bit that I go to a lot of Drupal events and nobody's ever really talking about this kind of stuff.
Quick comment.
Yeah.
I think there's a parallel to sort of organics.
Mm-hmm.
Because for a while, organics were like only at the co-op, and there was sort of like we held. I shop organic most of the time, but now you can get organics everywhere.
Right.
So in a sense, it's interesting. I didn't think about this until you mentioned it. So you have this open source software, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got this community of people that are writing it, but now it's growing,
Mm-hmm.
and we hope it grows because we all, as open
Right.
source, we all want it to grow. But now you've got people from corporations,
Mm-hmm.
IBM or whatever, the Department of Defense,
Mhm.
whatever, these people
Yeah.
in there doing stuff,
Mhm.
But it's getting bigger, which, so then there's that whole trade-off. And it's the
Right.
same with organics.
Right.
Now it's everywhere, and it's like, what does it mean that Walmart sells organics and all this kind of stuff? So, it's kind of an interesting discussion that way. I don't know.
Right. Anyways,
You could also
go ahead.
argue that it's, maybe, I hate to say bastardizing the word, like organics.
Yeah.
If Walmart is doing it, well, how organic is it? And, is it that it's labeled as free-range chicken, but in Michael Pollan's book,
Yeah.
it's labeled as it ain't necessarily so.
Right. Yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah, and
One thing that's healthy though about open source is the ability to fork.
Mhm.
And if a project is going a certain way, if Oracle is taking MySQL somewhere
Mhm.
that the community doesn't want it, well then they can fork it and make Maria.
Right.
Everybody's familiar with what forking means? Good, please let me know if you're not. In a previous session, I was Googling words in the session. I don't want anyone to have to do that here. If you don't understand a word, say so. Yeah.
One thing, I think open source might be starting to use as like a buzzword now, like just saying, oh, we're open source. Just saying that just for like the publicity or, recognition, instead of like, because I think most of us here think that it's the community behind it, which is the good thing about it, instead of just the fact that it's an open source code base.
Right.
Kind of like organics, like
Yeah.
it doesn't even mean it's organic anymore, it's just a buzzword because people want
Yeah.
organic stuff.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which ties into that spec the license, because there's so many different open source licenses. Is it an MIT license? Is it a GNU license? Those all differ on what you can do or can't do, and that license goes with what you fork and what you do. So it's better than in the organics because at least with open source, the license is there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a question of can you grok the license or not.
So one of the things that got me thinking about this is about a year and a half ago, I think it was, there was a Open Source North, a conference. Was anybody at that? It was sort of a local regional conference on open source, right? And I went to that, and I was a little bit, and if anybody here was involved, well, you're the only one who's there, so nobody here was probably planning it then. You didn't plan it, did you? Good. I was a little bit disappointed because there was very little talk about open source other than sort of as a, it's like, okay, we all do open source and we're there to talk about other things. I mean, the presenters were from like Microsoft and other things like presenting on tools that open source developers use. But there was almost no discussion about, what's behind the values behind open source or, the movement itself, how to start an open source project, things like that. I didn't hear any discussion about it at all, and that was a little bit disappointing. And I don't think it's malicious or anything. I think to some extent, a lot of the people who've been doing this for a long time take a lot of that for granted, and they come, to talk with other open source developers about the technology, and sometimes forget that there are new people coming into the movement or getting involved that don't understand the background and the history. So some of you ask, sort of part of the questions I'm asking myself are things like, should I be using making a greater effort to use open source products? I'm doing this presentation on a Keynote on my Mac, Apple. I am active in the Drupal community. I contribute to that the community a lot. I'm aware of some of the open source projects that interact with it, but I haven't been really making an effort to use other open source projects, to be involved and support other open source projects. And that's one of the things that I started thinking about in terms of my own involvement. I'm a freeloader in a lot of communities. Is that bad? I mean, I don't feel too bad about it because I'm helping develop another product that I know lots of other people are freeloading on, and I don't blame them. So it's sort of a give and take.
Plus you're not a freeloader because a lot of times if you're using a product, an open source product, you're talking about it, you're telling people about it, and it's growing in that way.
I think most open source developers would say, we don't care if you're able to give back, use our product, right? That's the first way you can support us, is just to use our product, because in using it, you're going to tell people about it, you're going to give, maybe you're going to run into bugs or problems and report them back. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you're using their product is helpful to them as a community, right? What this session isn't about is easy or ideological answers. I'm not here to guilt anybody into doing more. That's up to you. I'm here to talk about it. And it's neither a critique or a defense of the free software ideology. I'm not on the extreme end of the free, and I'm going to talk just brief for those who aren't really familiar with it. I'm going to try to lay that out really briefly in a minute. Nor am I here to criticize that. I just like to talk more about it, and to some extent, I'm still trying to figure out where I sort of fit in on all of that. I thought I would quickly, I'm going to do this really fast, because my own background is I started doing programming back in junior high in 1998, teaching myself to code. I thought this was, because at this time there weren't, we didn't have classes, we were sort of learning it ourselves. I got to college, and this was the first time that this whole debate really influenced me. Was I bought a Macintosh. I was really excited about it. It was really powerful. It did lots of cool things. But I'm like, okay, now how do I program it? And I couldn't. It was a closed system. There was really, on the early Apple Macintoshes, there wasn't just any way to, for a hobbyist, maybe if you were a real hacker, you could figure out ways to do things with it. But, I was pretty much limited by what Apple wanted me to be able to do. And the truth is that didn't, I think in reflection now, I think about if I had been able to start hacking on that right away, what other things I might have done in my life. But frankly, it gave me, I started learning how to use, the tools that were available on the Mac, and I got good at them, and that shaped very much the way I went. So I don't think I really noticed at the time that I was being denied my freedoms that the free software movement might say. But as I'm starting to come back later in my life and think about that. I've done some desktop publishing over the years. I played with a lot of these tools, the open source tools. I was aware of them, but again, not really deep in the open source movement. I started to pay closer attention to open source when, during my time with edemocracy.org, one of the biggest projects we ever did, and probably the most exciting, was we got a large grant from the British government to implement some of the work we were doing here in the Twin Cities and communities in the UK. And we were using open source tools. Well, we used some open source tools like Mailman. edemocracy.org was not a tech organization like Creating Tech. We were finding creative ways to use basic tech to engage people in public discussions. We used tools like Mailman, which was open source, to create listservs where people talked about public issues. We used Yahoo groups, which wasn't. The UK wanted to sort of take and set up these kinds of online discussions in communities around the UK, but they wanted it based on an open source tool. And there weren't really any open source tools at the time that had the feature set we wanted. But there was this group in New Zealand who had a tool like it, and they wanted to release it as an open source product, but needed some funding to do it, because it's a fair amount of work to actually get your code into a condition that you can just release it and let other people use it. And so I was sort of instrumentally involved in that whole process of working with them, not at the code end, but as an organization, to release Group Server is an open source tool. Group Server is never like taken off. It's still available. It's still an open source product, but I'm guessing it's not used by more than a couple hundred organizations. And then around 2008, 2009, I created my first Drupal site. At that time, for me, free source software was, I thought about it as crowdsourcing software. I didn't really think too much deeper about the ideology. These are long notes, and a lot of this was for me, just to help me remember what I wanted to talk about. The idea of crowdsourcing software intrigued me. In my e-democracy spirit, I like collaboration and engagement. This idea that from the ground up you could create things, that was kind of cool. But to be honest, the idea of a business model for open source was a little bit counterintuitive to me, but exciting too. The notion that people could create a business model around this kind of collaboration was really interesting. I was also very curious about whether or not open source communities were developing, how do you build something like Linux with a bunch of distributed volunteers around the world? That just kind of blew me away. And it's like, how can we, they must have figured something out about getting people to collaborate, and can we take and learn lessons from that and apply them to other social problems? And I'm not I haven't got the answer to that yet. I mean, I think I have learned things through my involvement in open source that I hadn't, ideas, but I've also learned that open source hasn't solved everything. I already mentioned I took the detour to the Chinese restaurant, and that's when I came back and started looking at Drupal and getting involved. And this is the key thing. To talk now about getting involved in a community, I went to my first Drupal camp back in, I think this would be 5 years ago. It would be like the 6th camp this summer. And I wasn't that involved in the community. Throughout the weekend, they kept saying, everybody can contribute back to Drupal. Everybody can make a contribution. And some people specifically talked about, like, how could you contribute to a project like Drupal? And Drupal has a culture. Drupal is probably one of the largest contributor communities in open source projects in terms of the number of different people that contributed. I'm not saying the largest, but it's up there in the top. And it's certainly not the largest in terms of usage, but just in terms of the number of people that give back. And part of it is that they have really thoughtfully implemented a lot of interesting processes to bring people into the community. At every camp you go to, pretty much, this isn't universally true, certainly at all the camps here locally, and most of them that I've been to, the day after camp they have a sprint, which is, all the Drupal people coming together to actually work on the code. So there's maybe 2 days of sessions, 1 or 2 days of sessions, and then there's a third day where they just sit down and they hack on code. And people, come across the country to these various camps because that's an opportunity to get together and work on the code. And I saw there was a sprint, and I'm like, there's no point in me going to that. I have nothing to offer. All through the weekend, they kept saying, oh no, we need people to read documentation, to do tests, things like that. They finally convinced me to come, and I went. I did some, spent the whole day kind of getting set up and learning a little bit. I'm pretty sure the issue I worked on that day 6 years ago is still open and unsolved in Drupal, but it wasn't a big important issue, obviously, or it would have been. They said after that, we have this, every week we have office hours in IRC where you can log into IRC and we'll help you solve problems in the Drupal issue queue. So they'll help you get started and contribute back to the community. I started doing that. About the third time I did it, the woman I was working with who's the woman who had been with me at the sprint. She's on IRC with me, and she's like, I gotta go somewhere. And she says, WebChick, can you help this guy? And does anybody here know who WebChick is? She was on the cover of Linux magazine. She was like the #2 person really in the Drupal community. She was, and here I am, this sort of newbie. I'm not really even a coder that much. I'm kind of learning. I was re-rolling a patch that night, which is basically the code. Somebody had submitted a patch. The code base, the patch hadn't been committed to Drupal code. The code base has changed some, so you had to kind of go in and make sure that the patch had got caught up with where the code was at. And they were showing me how to do that, and all of a sudden, WebCheck, again, who is like very famous in the Drupal community, is helping me. And I didn't know a lot, but I knew that this was kind of a big deal. And it had a huge impact on me. I think I felt like I was hooked now. I could not, give up the next week because WebChick spent an hour showing me how to re-roll a patch that she could have done in 2.5 minutes. She would have been done like that. I went to, this is a picture from DrupalCon Amsterdam, but I still didn't, I was gradually getting a sense of how open source worked. I didn't fully get it until I went to my first DrupalCon, which was actually in Austin, but it looked a little bit like this. At DrupalCons, this is changing a little bit now that Drupal 8 is out, but at the time, DrupalCon would be 3 days, but there would be like 3 or 4 days of extended sprints before and after where people from around the world would get together to work on the code. And that might be 50 to 100 people, but the day after the con, so the con is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, on Friday they have a big sprint, like the one we had at our Drupal camp, but at that extended sprint they had like 500 people in a room all working on Drupal code. And that's where you really start to see how a community works. I remember walking around and seeing these groups of people huddled around whiteboards, like diagramming things out. And it's like, now I'm starting to understand how you can create something like Drupal with thousands of people from around the world. I mean, I don't think if it were events like that, it would be a lot harder. It's not impossible, but anyways, that was sort of my history, sort of getting involved in it. Drupal is just one of many open source products. These are just a bunch of logos I threw up. I'm going to try and finish this up quick here so we can talk some more. I want to just say a few things sort of about the history, and I'm going to read a few quotes, and this is really close to the end of my presentation. How many people have heard of Richard Stallman before? Most people? Okay. I've heard of him before, and I know a little bit about his philosophy, but I've been looking at it more lately. And I won't stand here and again, either defend or criticize Richard Stallman, but he has some pretty strong views about free software. And we're going to get to, even the term open source, a lot of free software advocates don't like it for reasons that'll become clear in just a second. Richard Stallman in 1985 wrote the New Manifesto, which I think a lot of people would say kind of started this whole free software movement in an official kind of way. Free software existed before that, but that was just what people did before that because there was no real alternative. And it was around that time that companies like Apple were starting to close down and lock down a lot of software, which was bothering folks like Richard. And he said he considered the golden rule requires that if he likes a program, he must be able to share it with other people who like it. Software sellers who want to divide the users and conquer them, making each user agree not to share with others. I refuse to break solidarity with other users in this way. I cannot in good conscience sign a non-disclosure agreement or a software license agreement. Richard Stallman believes that proprietary software is not inefficient or unproductive. He believes it's bad, that it denies people their human rights. He has made famous the 4 freedoms in software: the freedom to run a program as you wish for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works, the freedom to distribute copies to your neighbor, and the freedom to distribute your own modified versions of the copy. Somebody brought up licenses, and I think to sort of understand the world of open source, you have to understand a little bit, and again, I'm a beginner at this, understand the whole licensing regime. And I'm, again, very much a beginner, but I think certainly affecting the Drupal community is this whole copyleft policy, which is that you cannot, when you release software, you can't deny the users the rights to use it in other ways. Or basically, I'm going to do a quick slide. The GPL is a license issued by the Free Software Foundation, I believe. It's the one Drupal uses. And it basically, it's a pretty broad license. It says that anybody can modify the work, anybody can copy and redistribute the work. You're allowed to charge for it. It's not there are licenses that say, you can reuse this code, but you can't charge for it or things like that. This is a license that allows you to do that. And you may not, if you make any changes or contribute any code to the product, you can't release that code under a more restrictive license. You have to maintain those. So even with Drupal, if I write a custom module for Drupal, I can sell that module to you, but I can't prevent you from giving it to your neighbor. It's like, if you're willing to pay me for that, you can, but I just don't have that right. Richard started the Free Software Foundation. Around 1998, a group of folks got together and formed the Open Source Initiative. According to one person involved in that, the purpose of the Open Source Initiative was to coin this new term, open source, which was to dump the moralizing and confrontational attitude that had been associated with free software and instead promote open source ideas on pragmatic business cases and business grounds. I would hazard to say that the Open Source Initiative is probably much more bigger and influential in the community today because it is where all the corporations doing open source hang out at. This weekend, actually, I'm assuming Richard Stallman is there, but I think there's a free software conference going on. I think it's their big annual conference. And I looked at a keynote from last year, and it looks to me like it's a couple hundred people talking about the sort of the hardcore free software ideas. I believe there's a large, OSCOM or something like that. Does anybody know that, the large open source conference? Has anybody been to that? I think that's sort of organized by the open. I'm getting a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I listened to some podcasts from Matthew who are talking about this, and I think they have a big conference that's sort of the generic open source conference with Linux distributions and Drupal and all the different kinds of projects that come, and they get thousands of people. This is when you talk about open source, there are people in the free software community who are a little bit offended, by that term open source because they really believe that the idea is different. I don't think I got it in here, but one of the key distinctions they like to make, and I just want to say it, is that for Richard Stallman and the free software community, free software is like, it's not like free beer, it's like free speech. So they're concerned, open source is more about just we're giving you this code, you can look at it, but it doesn't have that sort of ideological free speech component. I think this is about the last point. There were some comments about analyzing the open source community with other communities. There is a site called opensource.com, which is like taking the ideas of open source software and expanding that to just other kinds of open data, open government, open business. I think they're even interacting with like maker groups as being a kind of something similar to the open source. So trying to take these ideas and methods from open source and expand them. I had another long quote. I'm not going to read that here. I just want to, I talked too long already. I want to hear from you folks what your thoughts are on this, the importance of open software, source software as a value. Where do you stand? I'm not in the Richard Stallman sort of proprietary software is evil. I was listening to an interview with Richard, and he was talking about the fact that, he would not talk to somebody via Skype because he will not use Skype because Skype denies, it's a fairly extreme position. I'm certainly not there. On the other hand, I do believe that there is some value, some social value to open source software that goes beyond just the economic values. And I'm kind of trying to figure out really right now what that means and what I should do with that. And I'm eager to hear if you have similar questions or what you've decided. Anybody? I'm going to just pick somebody because I want to hear.
Sure. So I just feel extremely torn every day about this idea and this concept. So if I could sort of grow up to be Richard Stallman in the future, I would be very happy. I think that ideologically, that's what I shoot for. Like, I don't know how political this political talk should get, but like,
they can get as political as you want.
Sure. So like, I'd like to overthrow capitalism, whatever, do all this
Sure.
stuff, and then like live in this nice world. But but I signed an NDA last week at my job to develop software, and I use a Mac and I use proprietary software, and sometimes I feel like sometimes the quality of that software can be a little bit better than the quality of open source software. That's definitely not the general case, but in certain situations I've seen that, and so I see sort of the benefit of there are good closed source programs that exist. I'm glad that they exist, but I'm trying to balance how can I take care of myself and the people that I care about and make a living for myself currently, while at the same time trying to hold these values and actually, you know, fight for them and work for them. So right now, what that means for me is using closed source software and working for a company that makes money off of closed source software and helping to be a part of that, and attempting to build up my experience, my skill set, and hopefully my network of people, and eventually move into a situation where I can develop open source software and be funded at the same time. So I think that's kind of where I see the difficulties. How can we find the right way of getting funding and getting contributions so that people can be supported in their labor, which they're doing to make these software packages, and at the same time maintain that spirit that you're talking about of the community, right? So you're talking about these corporations coming in and investing because they're getting a lot of economic value out of the open source software. How can we get funding but not compromise our values? It's very complicated. I don't have an answer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You go first, and then I'm sorry. We'll come back to you.
It's a really tricky
Mhm.
situation because I come from like the free speech, like First Amendment, like wrote my thesis about how journalists should just like freaking be ready to die. You know, they should write anything and everything, otherwise they're like not taking advantage of their rights. But like on the internet, you know, I read like Coding Freedom and was like super inspired, and I run Linux on my VM because OS X is prettier, you know. So I struggle too, because I don't always see how, like, I'm all for the right to know, like that's really important to me, but I don't see, I have a hard time seeing how code is the same as speech. But I'm like,
Sure. You had something to say.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear that everyone else feels conflicted. That's basically, I certainly don't have any answers, but I figure I'd just talk about one of the questions that rolls around in my mind. And it goes to your kind of your point about the open source versus free software, and that as a sort of an important ideological split in the community. And I think I definitely, like, I identify more with the free software camp. I think that's what drew me to it in the first place. And certainly if I had my way of it, that would be, you know, the way that things happen. But as you mentioned, like, open source has been much more successful in large part because it's more business friendly. And so I guess what I wonder about and worry about sometimes is if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because just in terms of looking at sort of social goods, there is a lot of social good in just the pragmatic, you know, sort of ideological-less open source movement. You know, just like it still allows people to tinker with the tools they use. It still funnels corporate resources into things that are available to everybody. It still allows communities to form very, very easily without, you know, sort of boundaries on who's allowed in and who gets a say. So there are a lot of good things about open source, even when even when it's sort of the least confrontational form of it. But on the other hand, sometimes it feels like that's selling out free software. Sometimes it feels like our eager participation in open source and in the web world, we just license everything as MIT license, which just to quickly explain what that means. It means MIT is not copyleft, so you can take an MIT license thing, you can change it, and you can basically more or less apply your own license to it. So you can just keep your changes. You don't have to distribute them. You don't have to provide them under the same license, all that sort of thing. And so I guess what I worry about is if participating in that, you know, eagerly licensing all our stuff as MIT, if the social good we get from that is worth sort of giving up the actual the more revolutionary spirit of free software. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. But
Just I read a couple articles of like largest open source contributors in the country right now are like Microsoft and Facebook.
To answer the
Mhm.
open source versus free software, I think that a lot of these tools require resources. They require
Mhm.
resources to debug. They require resources for deployment. As a Ruby developer, if I want to retrieve a library, I require a gem. Well, that needs a server, and it takes maybe $5,000 a month to host because of the popularity of it. Well, I don't think that the free software would be able to provide that, but open source would. So, I would be in favor of free software where it comes to more of the fundamental building blocks, like Linux, where you don't want Canonical or Red Hat to make something proprietary. You want them to, whatever change they make, have to incorporate that back.
Mhm.
But for many companies, they don't want to open up the kimono. In my case, that would be a bad deal.
Mhm.
So they do want some privacy. They don't want to have to be legally required to contribute it back. And I think that's an important piece.
Sure. We should get out of here. I'm willing to talk to, if anybody wants to talk to me about this later or after look me up. I'm just going to really quickly share one in the Drupal community, kind of one of the places this tension comes in right now is with Drupal 8. Where there's actually been a fork of Drupal. About 3 years ago, a group of people I know forked Drupal to make Backdrop, and the concern was that Drupal is becoming more and more. A lot of the work that went into Drupal 8 was to make it more friendly for large enterprises, and incidentally, not so easy to use for small nonprofits and individuals. A lot of what would have been the heart of the community 10 years ago, and it's still an open source product or project with all of, in theory, the same ideals, but it's moving in this direction where it's becoming more and more friendly to big enterprises and corporations. But they're trying to make it usable by, to continue to make it easy enough. But a lot of people are just disputing that and saying, it isn't as easy anymore, and we're not sure that we can stay in the community. And these are the kinds of tensions we have, and these are the kinds of questions I grapple with as a member of the Drupal community. Do I continue to just go down this road of supporting this project, which is getting more and more corporate and less accessible to the kinds of nonprofits that built it, and the reasons that I got interested in it to start with? So thank you all for coming.